Good afternoon. We're about to wrap up. I spend my Sunday mornings watching Sunday shows. Some people call it Yell TV, but that's not the case when I watch Fareed Zakaria's GPS. And I want to credit Fareed with two things, actually. He keeps me very informed, and he keeps me very fit, because I actually watch the show from my elliptical machine. And the only thing is, I wind up spending a full hour on the machine because I get very engrossed in the show, and I can't. Each segment is a little bit of a teaser to stay on. So I thank you, and my trainer is particularly thankful. Matt is very happy that I have become addicted to Fareed's show. And frankly, last Sunday was no different. Last Sunday I was watching, as I always do, and there was insightful reporting on the Ukraine and reporting on what's going on in Brazil as it prepares for the soccer matches. And I thought, all right, those are two markets I'm watching on a regular basis. So I really see this show, for those of us here, I'm not supposed to make an endorsement, but as a must view on a Sunday morning if you want to look at global markets and understand the global economy and the global world far better. So I feel very fortunate that Fareed has agreed to join us today. This week you get a double dose. You can get him on Friday today. You can catch him again on Sunday. And he also volunteered that we'll have time for Q&A. So you will be able to ask questions as opposed to on television. So with that, very briefly, let me bring up to the stage Fareed Zakaria.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Fred. Thank you so much. I've realized that always from first meeting Fred that he was a charming and persuasive man. But I've discovered just how persuasive he is by looking at this conference and the lineup of speakers he's been able to get. I have to say that I think this is quite remarkable and a testament to Fred's tenacity and ability to get people here. I thought what I'd do is just talk a little bit about the world as I see it. I was looking at that list of people, and I suspect that you heard a lot about all the challenges that we face going forward, the challenges to American competitiveness, the challenges to growth, the challenges for emerging markets. And it's all true. And I hear it all the time when I travel around the world. In fact, what I'm struck by is the level of, I wouldn't say gloom, but caution that you hear everywhere. I mean, the Americans are cautious, apprehensive. You see it in the polling data. And then, of course, if you go to Europe, America looks positively cheerful in comparison with Europe. But even when you go to emerging markets like China and India, which were once kind of oases of optimism, what you see now is a much greater sense of wariness. People in India, of course, worried that the economy has not been delivering. People in China worried that it's slowing down. Brazil is already growing at around 1%, if that. You see this happening almost everywhere. Turkey went from 7.5% down to about half that pace. And I thought it would be worth stepping back a little bit and asking ourselves what's going on in a kind of historical context, because sometimes you can't quite see what's happening, and when things are going well, we assume that will continue to go well forever, and when things are going badly, or when you hit a rough patch, you also assume that that rough patch will extend. So it's straight line projection in both cases. I think that part of the reason it's difficult to figure this out is we are in the middle of creating a new global system. And as a result of it, it's very difficult to figure out exactly what any one hiccup, any one crisis, any one cyclical adjustment means. So I think back to when I was growing up. I grew up in India in the 1960s and 70s. And the world could not have looked more different, right? By the late 1970s, when I was thinking about leaving India to come to the United States to get an education, to go to college, India was going through probably the worst phase it had gone through in its independent history. You had martial law, which was called the emergency. You had the lowest growth it had had in 4 decades. You had the highest inflation. And so I was thinking of doing something, going to the United States. I met with an American friend of mine in Bombay, in what was then called Bombay. And he says to me, "You're thinking of going to America for college?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Why would you want to come to America? It's hell out there." So I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he started to explain to me. He told me about this thing called stagflation, the worst economy since the Great Depression, he said. A combination of unemployment and inflation rates that were verging in the 21, 22% range. We talked about Vietnam, Watergate. You know, you think people don't trust politicians today. Think back to a few years after Vietnam and Watergate and the degree of suspicion and hostility towards politics and politicians. He talked about how the Soviet Union was on the march, about how Japan was destroying Detroit and destroying the auto industry. And I was certainly sobered, but I have to confess, it's always a wonderful trait of Americans that they really don't know that much about what's going on in the rest of the world. So if America looked bad, he really hadn't spent enough time in India. And so I still decided to apply, and I applied to college, and I got to college right in the middle of what was being described as the worst recession since the Great Depression. That is the recession of the early 1980s. And what was striking to me was very quickly the mood turned. And by 1983-84, you had a robust recovery in the United States. You had Ronald Reagan campaigning for re-election on the Morning in America theme. And by 1985-86, the real question everyone was asking is not what is happening to the United States, but what is happening to the Soviet Union, and are the Soviet Union's problems cyclical or structural? And the answer, of course, was deeply structural, and by 4 years later, there was no Soviet Union. That reality of the extraordinary shift that took place in the public's imagination of an America that was besieged by the Soviet Union, by stagflation, by Japan, and then moving to a very different place very quickly, still stays in my mind, because at the time that was not how people were reading it. You know, in 1987 you had the stock market crash, still the largest crash in percentage terms that the stock market has ever had, 22% in one day. And I remember I was at Harvard at the time. The New York Times asked probably the most famous economist in the world, John Kenneth Galbraith at the time, to write and explain what had just happened. And he said, "Oh, this is very simple. We have just gone through our version of the crash of 1929. He should have known. He was the author of a great book about it. Let's just hope our recession is not as bad as the recession of the 1930s. Well, 1 week later, the stock market was back to normal. The economy actually had barely budged, and things started, were pretty much back to normal. But then we did get, a few years later, a real recession, and a pretty bad one, the recession of 91, 92. And to remind you of just how bad that was in those days, the most famous line out of the campaign, the presidential campaign of that era, 1992 campaign, was Paul Tsongas, the senator from Massachusetts, who said, "The Cold War is over and Germany and Japan have won." And that was conventional wisdom. I mean, you don't have a campaign slogan that people don't agree with. It was so great was the economic anxiety that a sitting president did not get reelected, despite the fact that he presided over the end of the Cold War. This is George H.W. Bush. That he presided over victory in the Gulf War. Remember, that was the war against Iraq that went well. With 91% approval ratings at the end of that war. And within a year and a half, he loses the election to a up to then obscure governor from Arkansas with a history of marital problems, right? That was and by the way, this was the time also you had a third-party candidate come up, which is, you remember, whenever America has a deep sense of anxiety and the feeling that the two parties cannot provide for the aspirations of the average person, there often is a third party that comes up. Now, bizarrely, in America in recent history, that third candidate has often been a billionaire. So it was Ross Perot in this case, speaking to the needs of the average American. You know, Donald Trump tried to play this role in the last go-around. Didn't quite work, because it turned out he didn't like shaking hands with people. Small problem if you're trying to run for political office. But the point I'm making is Ross Perot got a larger percentage of the vote than any third-party candidate since 1912, since Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and William Howard Taft ran against each other. Such was the economic anxiety about the hollowing out of America. And yet, 2 years later, the story that was dominating the headlines was the fact that the Clinton boom was so robust that economists couldn't make sense of it. They couldn't make sense of it because there used to be this thing called NAIRU, the non-accelerating rate of unemployment, which said you can't get unemployment down beyond a certain point without triggering inflation. And for 4 years, that's exactly what happened during the Clinton years. The unemployment rate just kept dropping and dropping and dropping, 25 million jobs created, and inflation was nowhere to be seen. But that wasn't how people saw it at the time. Remember, there was the Mexican crisis, which morphed into the Thai crisis, which morphed into the Asian crisis, and everyone said, this is it. You know, the emerging markets were a fad, they're over. I remember I was editing Foreign Affairs magazine at the time. I ran a piece by a very distinguished, super intelligent guy, who was a somewhat unknown professor at Princeton at the time, Paul Krugman. And it was the cover story that we ran called The Myth of Asia's Miracle. And the basic point was Asia has had a good couple of decades, but it's over. You're not going to see any more growth in Asia. You're going to see a long period of stagnation. This was in 1997, I think, and by the end of 1998, every Asian economy was back, booming. But of course, that gets you to 1998. And in 1998, the Russians default. Long-term capital management explodes, and Robert Rubin stands at the steps of the United States Treasury and says this is the worst financial crisis the world has experienced since the 1930s. Well, 1 week later, the Federal Reserve of New York organized a bailout, which it insisted was not a bailout. Russia paid a price. There was no contagion. And again, we're back to the economy was moving forward. But of course, that gets you to 2000. March of 2000, the NASDAQ crashes. $3 trillion wiped off American stock exchanges. And everyone said, this technology bubble was just crazy. I mean, you know, everyone was sure that other people had invested in these crazy companies that made no sense. Of course, nobody had themselves bought any of these stocks. And the one thing we were sure we'd never see were these crazy companies that were really websites that kids used with no business model. You know, that was the one thing we were never going to see again. And for sure we didn't see it for a good 18 months until MySpace and Twitter and Zynga and Instagram and all of these things started, which were all websites that kids used with no business model, until Goldman Sachs one day said that Facebook was worth $50 billion, and then they all had business models, right? And that brings us to our current crisis. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that the current crisis, the recession, was not real, deep, painful. Of course, it was all those things. It combined two huge aspects of Western economies, credit and housing markets, and as a result, the interconnection between the two really collapsed the economies. The point I'm trying to make is, notice that in each of these times, people are sure that the bad times will go on for a long time, and they miss the recovery, and they miss the resilience of the system. And what I think explains that fact is that over the last 30 years, what we have done is created a very different and new global economy, and actually, this bank has been at the heart of it. If you look back to 1979, the world was divided geopolitically, but also geoeconomically. The number of countries that were part of the open trading system in the world was the United States, Western Europe, Canada, 5 countries in Asia. That was it, right? And you can see that in the growth numbers. The number of countries growing at 3% or more in 1979 was about 30. The number of countries growing at 3% or more in 2007, before the crash, was 124. The number growing today, even after all the troubles, is 85. So what you have seen in the last 30 years is a kind of tripling of the number of countries that have found a way to plug into a new global system and somehow take advantage of that and move forward and raise incomes. And that's the big story, honestly, of the world that we have been living through. When people look back from the end of the Cold War to today, this is the headline. Al-Qaeda will get a paragraph somewhere, for sure. But the real story is something I've called the rise of the rest. For 400 years, you had Western countries rising, and in the last 30 years, about 2 billion people from outside the West have found a way to enter into this new global system and to participate in it. And if you look at almost all the things that are happening as a consequence, they are a result of that reality. The extraordinary decline in inflation, for example, that has taken place around the world. In 1979, the number of countries with hyperinflation was about 30. The number of countries with hyperinflation today is 0. 2 years ago, I would have had to say 1, but Zimbabwe dollarized its economy, and so today there are actually no countries in the world that have hyperinflation. Think about how big a change that is from the 1970s, where every country was experiencing out-of-control inflation and the political and social instability that came out of that. Think about this extraordinary access to capital that has taken place around the world that is, really truly breathtaking. And think about the underlying condition of all of this, by the way, which is political stability. If not for the end of the Cold War and the political stability that produced, you would not be able to have this open world economy, which sits, as it were, on a platform of political stability. In the 1980s, there were 18 civil wars taking place around the world in which the Soviet Union was funding, arming, supplying a government, an insurgency, some band that was in some way waging war. And the United States was funding, supplying, and arming the other side of every one of those 18 conflicts. And so you had these proxy wars taking place all over the world. And these are not small affairs. Just to remind you, 3 million people died in Indochina in the 1970s. 1 million people died in the Middle East in the 1980s. 4 million people died in Africa in the late 1980s, early 1990s. So these were very, very traumatic. And if you look at the data now, the violence has just declined dramatically since then. There are many centers that track all this violence. It's pretty clear that the numbers are down either 50% from a 30 or 40-year average, or 70% depending on how you count it. But the point is, we're living in much, much more peaceful times. So you take these two forces, if you will, political stability and economic convergence, and you put them together, and you have this new world that's been created. And now you layer on top of it one third force, a kind of super accelerator, which has been the information revolution. And the information revolution has really, had this extraordinary effect of truly creating a global market that didn't really exist. I mean, people used to trade with one another. When you talked about globalization in the 50s, what you meant was that the Germans made stuff and they sold it to the French, and the French made stuff and they sold it to the Germans. Now you have a situation where, a GE jet engine is made in somewhere between 14 and 22 countries. And actually, there is a very important question as to whether or not we know what country's GDP it should be placed on. The economic data that were created in the 1930s for industrial economies really don't even apply today. You're not even sure how you would make sense of it all. And so that kind of world, with this extraordinary degree of convergence economically, stability in political terms, and connectivity in technological terms, is the world that we're living through now. Now, when you look around at that world, of course, it is going to have characteristics that are not a straight line projection. So remember the world I was describing. Many, many crises, many, many points of high peaks, but also troughs. But during that period I described, global GDP doubles, global trade triples, global capital flows are up fourfold. So the secular trend is very clear, despite the fact that you go through very significant economic downturns. And if you want to look at how these work, your typical developing country or typical emerging market goes through this cycle. It does reforms, particularly once it gets through the initial phase of getting out of a quasi-socialist, high tariff barrier, high import substitution model. And it starts the reform process with a big bang, bold reforms. It attracts a lot of capital. It grows fast. The growth makes it believe that it has found some magic formula for growth and that it's smarter than everybody else, and it stops reforming. It stops reforming, it gets lazy and complacent. Growth slows, and you get a crisis. It's almost like a clock. So, if you look at Brazil, Brazil perfectly exemplifies that clock. Reforms under Cardozo, huge boom, lots of foreign investment. And then China, by the way, starts growing and importing a lot of Brazilian stuff. Under Lula, they begin to think that they're geniuses. It's always a mistake. Warren Buffett has this great line where he says, biggest mistake you can make is mistaking whether you're lucky or smart in business. And, the Brazilians mistook the fact that they had been lucky for the fact that they were smart, and growth starts slowing down. And now they face that challenge. Do you do the second push of reforms? And you will see that the emerging market countries that endure are the ones who at that, if you think of this as a clock, at the 6 o'clock point, the ones who then institute a second and a third wave of reforms. And if you want to look back historically, that's Taiwan, that's South Korea, that's Singapore, that's Hong Kong, that was Japan. We'll see whether they do it this time around. But in general, people find it very hard to do. And because you're talking about, in a sense, getting your GDP from $200 per capita to $2,000 or $3,000, the government just has to stop doing really stupid things, right? But then getting from 2,000 to 4,000, now you're talking about really modernizing and marketizing many elements of your economy. Then getting from 4,000 to say 10,000, now you're talking about modernizing your legal system, your accounting system, getting corruption. That's much, much harder to do. And so that's why you get what's called the middle income trap. So, you get the low-hanging fruit first, you get up to $4,000 per capita, and then you find it very hard. All of Latin America, with the exception of Chile, is stuck in that place and has been stuck there for decades. Argentina has been stuck there since the 1920s. I mean, it just gives you a sense of how difficult it is to move out of that cycle and move forward. And if you look at the reforms in Taiwan and look at the reforms in South Korea, after the Asian crisis, you see that acceleration that allowed them to move forward. And so we face that you have a fascinating experiment going on around the world right now with the 6 big emerging markets that are going to have elections, right? You've got South Africa, Indonesia, India, Brazil, Turkey, I'm missing one more, Mexico. All of them are having big elections. And the question will be, will this political change produce the reform process that you're looking for? Where it will not, I guarantee you there will not be any significant uptick in growth. Where they will, you're likely to see it, and markets are already beginning to recognize that. So India, people are hopeful because they see a new leader who seems committed to economic growth. South Africa, people are writing off because there doesn't seem much hope. Brazil, frankly, people are writing off because it seems as though Dilma is likely to get reelected, and that doesn't seem to be a particular story of change. You have an interesting case with Turkey where there's going to be reform, there's going to be an election, he'll probably get reelected, but so far they have actually continued to do a lot of economic reform, all the while becoming politically more authoritarian. And so this challenge is part and parcel of the new global economy that you're in. Nobody said that because you have a single global economy, countries won't make mistakes. When the cost of capital goes down, everybody does stupid things. And that's the one piece we are not going to be able to legislate or regulate away. I guarantee you that throughout history, from the South Sea bubble to the present, when the cost of capital collapses, people do stupid things. And so that's going to happen again. And that is what will separate the people who succeed, as it should, from the companies, countries, individuals who don't. What you will have to do looking forward is ask yourself whether the big picture that I'm describing is in any way threatened by some of the forces that you've been talking about. I would argue there are challenges on the margins. Certainly, the idea that Russia would defect out of the settled consensus of the post-Cold War world is very troubling. But I think one of the very helpful things here is that the Russian economy is paying a pretty heavy price already. And of course, Mr. Putin will not do anything now because he's got a big boost in the polls, and it's very clear that this is popular. But more capital has left Russia in the last month than in the preceding 14 months. The Russian economy growth rate is now set to be 0. It was going to be 2 against a backdrop of average of 5 over the last 5 years. If you look at where it's S&P has just put it at, I think, a B minus, which is, one notch up from junk bond status. So the funny thing about Russia is it can play this 19th century game that John Kerry described it as, but its economy is actually quite integrated into the global economy. And so there is this price it is paying, and it will have to decide whether or not it really wants to take on this price. By the way, the odd thing about the whole Ukraine business is the winner loses, right? The winner of Ukraine, imagine if Russia got Ukraine, managed to wrestle it away, and there's a part of me that feels like we should tug a little bit on that rope and then say, you win, you get it. First thing that happens is you get a bill for $15 billion. That's just for this year. Right? That's what will keep Ukraine afloat for this year. Then you've got to deal with the ongoing problem. So in a very real sense, there's a part of me that wonders, why, isn't there a Bob Dylan line that losers will one day be the winners and the winners will one day be the losers? I feel like this is a perfect example of that. Getting Crimea is going to cost Russia at least $5 billion. And so maybe we should give them all of it, and then let them. It's their problem. Of course, we get Ukraine, we have to pay that $15 billion. So you ask yourself, are these trajectories that I've been talking about likely to be in some way interrupted? The basic trajectory of economic convergence, the basic trajectory of technological connectivity, and I would argue no. In fact, what you're seeing is, many of these are now in hyper speed. Because if you look at companies today, we were sitting next to a lady who's selling pickles, and she's already a multinational. I mean, the idea that when you were, 20 or 30 years ago, when you thought about a multinational, you thought about a big company headquartered in New York. Nowadays, people start companies in their college dorm rooms, and they're sourcing from one country, supplying to another, using the cloud. The costs of the barriers to entry have simply collapsed. And that is only going to continue as computing power continues to expand. All this raises challenges that are very, very real and very deep. But the way I'd put it is they're likely to be challenges of success and abundance and acceleration, not of decline and collapse. We are planning too much for the downside when what we should be planning for is problems of the upside. What happens when machines get so good and so fast that you don't quite know what to do with human beings? I was talking to a guy who runs a whole bunch of factories where he's replacing the foreman with a machine, because these are furnaces where the guy used to adjust the thermostat, the foreman. It required a lot of judgment to figure out where you're going to do these things. Well, he's finding that the guy used to take the temperature every minute and adjust it. Then they got a machine that helped him, and it would take it every half a minute. And now they have a machine that takes it every 1/10 of a second and simultaneously corrects the furnace. And obviously can do it at a much greater level of precision. So I said to the CEO, what happens to the foreman? He said, honestly, he's just in the way now. And we just have to figure out what to do. And there's a part of me that wonders whether that line is almost a totemic line about human beings and manufacturing processes. They're just in the way. And the task of manufacturing and advanced manufacturing is going to be to find a way discreetly and politely to get the human beings out of the way and allow these things to go on. I mean, this is true happening in other professions as well. You look at medicine and you look at surgery, and they're finding that you can have this laser-operated, computer-operated surgery where the computer is mapping to the a millicentimeter the exact shape and nature of the tumor, and the laser cuts it. And you say to yourself, would you rather that, or would you rather the doctor who may have had a couple of glasses of wine the night before, may have had a fight with his wife in the morning, and it suddenly makes you realize those are the kinds of problems that you might face. The final point I just want to make before we open it up is we've talked a lot about what's going on around the world, and I continue to believe that this broad trend that I'm describing is going to be very good for the rise of the rest, with obviously some winners and some losers. What will it mean for the United States? I am still very optimistic about America. And let me tell you why. If you were to look at the United States 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and say, in the technologies of the future, in the industries of the future, how does the United States do? I think people 30 years ago, 40 years ago would have said very well, but it has real competitors. Germany, Japan, think of the Dutch consumer electronics, television sets. If you look today at the technologies of the future, the reality is there literally is no non-American company in the top ranks. The top 8 technology companies in the world by market cap are all American. If you look at the German economy that everyone talks so much about, Germany is basically a second industrial revolution economy. They make cars, chemicals, machine tools. Great stuff, they do it very well. In the whole space of information technology, in the whole space of the third industrial revolution, they have one company, SAP, and that was founded 30 years ago. If you look at anything in the future, nanotechnology, biotechnology, 3D printing, not to mention social networks, telephony, you basically have American companies. And of course, there are a couple, I mean, Samsung for sure, but it's a remarkably small number. And American dominance in this sense of the future has increased in the last 30 years, not decreased. Secondly, the United States is the only demographically growing rich country in the world. So when people talk about a housing recovery in the United States, I know, that it goes up and down, and mortgage rates are up and down. Here's the basic point. America is the only rich country in the world that adds people to its population. We will add 3 million people to the population this year. We will do that every year. We take in more immigrants legally every year than the rest of the world put together. And so when you have that profile demographically, you are going to get some growth. How the housing is going to grow. Housing is going to grow. My theory, my complicated theory behind this is very simple. Kids don't like to live with their parents forever. And by the way, this may be true on both ends of that transaction. And so when you add 3 million people to the population, you're going to have a demand for housing. It's how exactly it works itself out, I don't know. But you're going to get a demand for housing. Third, the energy revolution. I'm not going to say much about this. You've read enough about it. But it's real, and it's very deep, and it's very widespread. Finally, government in America is working. Now I know you think I've lost it, and I've probably lost the audience. But here's what I'm going to tell you. Washington, with the exception of Fred's fine institution, is not working for sure. Everybody knows that. I'm not going to contest that. That is one of those conventional wisdoms that, alas, is true. But here's the beauty. In the United States, and Tocqueville noticed this in 1832, the truth of the matter is the federal government doesn't do all that much in comparison to what goes on at the state and local level. A lot of the economic action takes place at the level of state and local government. And if you look at what is happening at state and local government, particularly big cities, you see a remarkable renaissance of good government. So 30 or 40 years ago, most of the big cities in America were run by political hacks, making decisions on a totally partisan basis. Today you have much sharper people, often technocrats, surrounded by technocrats, using data very carefully. And you can see this. If you look at Bloomberg's 12 years in New York, you see an extraordinary technocratic administration. You look at what Garcetti is doing in LA right now. You look at what Rahm Emanuel is doing in Chicago. You look at what Denver is doing, largest expansion of rail. You look at Nashville, which has become the healthcare center of the United States. In all these places, mayors are reaching across party lines, combining with the private sector, finding a way to foster growth, and on the ground conditions for private sector-led growth in the United States are very strong. Don't take my word for it. Ask the Germans, who are moving manufacturing facilities out of Germany into the United States at record numbers. And why? Because they are finding that if you go to South Carolina, if you go to places like that, you have extraordinary opportunities, and you have, the one problem they have is trained labor, but the truth is manufacturing doesn't need so many people, so they train their own, and they're able to make it work. So all of which tells me, yes, there are problems, and we could all talk about the problems forever, and I'm reading the Thomas Piketty book, like everybody else, or at least pretending to read it. It's 750 pages, a lot of graphs. But the truth of the matter is, The United States remains the most competitive rich country in the world, and that is the relevant comparison. We're not competing with the Chinese laborers at, at $5 an hour. We're competing against other rich countries, and the United States still has an extraordinary portfolio to offer. So my basic message to you, I suppose, is very simple. Don't worry, be happy. Just plan for the upside. That's the only way you're going to make money. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Questions, comments, disagreements, and please feel free to do all of that. Yes, sir. There are people with mics running around, so if you just wait for the mic so that everyone can hear the question. The only thing I would ask is that there be a question mark at the end of the question, and just remember, everybody is waiting for you to finish asking the question.
Okay. My name is Stokes from Pan African American Chamber of Commerce. My question, I just have two of them. What is the global implication of the top 1% having more than the 99% in terms of effective demand and global growth? Secondly, will the big to fail reoccur? Thank you.
I didn't understand the second one.
Will the big to fail when there are some companies that say they are too big to fail?
Oh, sure, sure.
Do we have to build them out again?
Sure. So let me take the second one first. The too big to fail problem. This, I think, Tim Geithner has tried to explain this, and I think it continues to trouble him. The problem that you have in a very large interconnected global economy in which capital flows very freely is that the banks are at the absolute center of it. The banks are the central nervous system of the global economy. And therefore, you have this extraordinary paradox at the heart of what has happened over the last 5 or 6 years. It is largely true that a key contributor to the crisis and recession that followed was the irresponsibility of banks. It is also true, however, that the only way to quickly restabilize the system was to shore up those very banks. And you're not going to get around that problem. So in my opinion, the too big to fail is, we want to believe that we have solved this problem. But this problem is at the heart of modern capitalism. You can't solve it. You don't want to solve it in the sense that you want there to be big global banks that are very liquid. Yeah, you want them to do a little bit less of the risky stuff. But a lot of what got them into trouble, by the way, was giving loans to people to buy houses. Right? I mean, it's true they were also doing fancy derivative stuff. But by and large, what got them into trouble was pretty simple vanilla loans to people who couldn't afford to pay those loans. And everyone is complicit in that. And the question again, as I say, is when the cost of capital goes down again, can you be sure that those banks won't be doing things like that? You can put in place some regulations, but the whole history of capitalism tells you that people will do things like that. So what you want to do to the largest extent you can is to try and ring fence the rest of the economy so that it doesn't have quite the downturn faced. The simplest way you can do that is to raise capital requirements, which have been done. You raise capital requirements, you cross your fingers, and you think that is likely to be the single most important piece of all this. So if I look at all the bank reforms, I think the Basel III stuff, which the banks of course hate, is probably the most effective. Because more than anything else, that cushions you in a downturn. I don't believe regulators will have the power to foresee what the next crisis was. If they were, they wouldn't be regulators, they'd be running hedge funds and making billions, right? The reality is what you're trying to do is put a cushion in place so when the next inevitable crisis happens, the downturn is not as sharp and things like that. On the 1%, I think it's a huge, complicated subject. Let me just say, my view is, when looking at it from the point of view of the United States and even African countries, here's what I would say. There are 3 problems that inequality really is referring to. The first is the rise of the super rich, the 1%. The second is the enlargement of the super poor. That's 46 million Americans on food stamps right now. Okay? The third is the stagnation of the median wage. The first one gets a lot of publicity. frankly, because, we all see it. We all look at these hedge fund guys and the private equity guys, and we think to ourselves, there is no justice in the world. How can this make any sense? Why do they have, how can they afford to buy planes, trains, and whatever else? But it's not entirely clear to me how solving that problem changes the other two. That is to say that there isn't enough money up there to frankly do massive redistribution, though I'd be perfectly comfortable with more progressive taxation. The real problem, I would argue, is the other two. The growth of the super poor, and in a country like the United States, it's shameful because you could very easily fix that problem. There's very simple ways to spend more money on the poor. We don't spend money on the poor because they don't vote in the United States. It's a very sad, brutal reality that the people who don't get represented in the United States are two groups of people, the very poor and the young, because neither of them vote. In one case, constitutionally, if you're under 18, you can't vote. In the other case, we frankly do all we can to stop people who are poor from voting, and as a result, they don't get represented. And that could change with limited amounts of money that would make a huge difference. Nutrition programs, all kinds of stuff that was targeted at the poor. The flattening of the median wage is the big problem because it affects everybody. It's the largest piece of this bubble. We don't really know the answer to it. Obviously, it has something to do with globalization and technological change. It has something to do with the collapse of educational standards. But nobody has a quick fix. And certainly it isn't, it's much easier to blame, again, this is my own view, it's much easier to blame the 1% for it. It's not entirely clear what the relationship between the rise of the 1% and the stagnation of the median wages. So if I were to focus on this, I would say first fix the problem that's the easiest to fix. Spend money on poor people. Secondly, ask yourself, how do you get the median wage up? And getting the median wage up would be the biggest payback. If you have to have higher taxes to finance all this, we should view it as a necessary way to get revenue rather than some kind of punitive action, because I don't think that the United States is really about punishing rich people. I think that as that great American Deng Xiaoping once said, it's glorious to be rich. At the back there. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Thank you for being here today. My name is Julie Agarwal. My question is, it's a follow-on to what you just said. Some countries, the lowest paying person in a company, their wage is a factor, like maybe 7 or 10 of what the highest paying person is. And do you think that could somehow help reach this medium wage that you're talking about without violating the rules of capitalism?
Well, here's how I think you'd have to think about it. At the end of the day, wages are competitive, right? And the supply of labor is, these are set by market forces. You're not going to pay much more than your competitors because you don't want to be at a competitive disadvantage. I would say that when you start getting up into upper management, that becomes less and less true. And what is more and more happening is that you have a kind of game that is being played by compensation committees, consultants who are hired by compensation committees, boards, and CEOs, where they, it's a little bit like Lake Wobegon, that radio show in the United States where everyone is above average. So no compensation committee, no board wants to believe its CEO is below average, right? How do you make sure that your CEO is above average? You pay him above average. In fact, every board is convinced that CEO is in the top decile. And so you have this ratchet effect where everybody keeps getting paid, and the CEO is getting paid that, the CFO gets paid it. So I think there's something inherently corrupt about the way in which the top layer of American management is paid, and a lot of it has to do with the failure of boards. I'm not sure that will lift up the average wage for the worker who is being paid on a competitive basis based on what another company somewhere else is providing. And you look at German wages, American wages, these are all factored in. So I tend to imagine that boards don't function well in the United States. This should be fixed, but it won't unfortunately help with the, what do you do about, one of the reasons that these median wages are going down is people are being laid off. It's not that the guy at Intel who works at an Intel chip manufacturing plant is not being paid well. It's that there is a new $4 billion Intel plant that was just put in place in the northern United States somewhere, I forget which state, let's say Minnesota. It's 2 football fields long. It's a $4 billion investment, and it employs 2,000 people. That's it. If you had seen a comparable plant put in by Ford in the 1950s, it would have, I think, reasonably, one could have guessed, it would have employed 75,000 people, right? That's the difference. And so you have a lot of these unemployed auto parts makers in Michigan dragging down the wage level. Sir. I'm trying to look around, so if you just put your hand way up, it'll help me.
Thank you, Vareed. In terms of the energy policy in the United States, what's your view about the Keystone project for Canada? Do you think it should be approved?
Yeah, let me be honest. My bottom line is this. I understand the concerns about tar sands. I think it's a dirty fuel. You know, I wish it were not. If in a perfect world, the stuff wouldn't be used. But here's the thing. I don't understand how building or not building the Keystone pipeline will have any impact on that, because the tar sands are Canadian. They are going to mine them. They are going to turn them into oil, and they are going to burn. The CO2 is going to be released in the air. It's not going to be released in the United States, by the way, under any circumstance, because Keystone will take it down to New Orleans and it'll probably be sold from there, you know, in some way or the other, or it goes on boats to Asia. So it seems to me that it has become, and when you talk to many of its supporters, they will admit this, it has become a symbolic battle. Keystone itself strikes me as something that will help the United States without it can't have much of a net effect on the environment, because the stuff is going to be burned anyway. It'll either be burned in Asia or it's not. The Canadians are not going to stop themselves from developing this because the United States doesn't build Keystone. And in fact, if it isn't built, the most likely thing that will happen is it'll go on rail down to the same place in the United States. And of course, that is much more energy intensive and polluting. Pipelines are actually a very energy efficient way to transport energy, to transport liquid energy, because, you know, once you lay the pipeline, you're not using trains, you know, that burn coal, etc. So I think that on the merits, it's very difficult to make the case against Keystone. The whole argument is one about the symbolism, and shouldn't the United States be moving to another kind of energy entirely. My heart is with those people, and my heart is with I would like us to move much more quickly to a green energy future. We were just talking about photovoltaics, and it's clear that the costs of photovoltaics are collapsing. And so I very much hope we can go in that direction. But meanwhile, while solar remains under 5% of our energy use, we do have to figure out what is the most efficient, economically productive way to get energy. And it doesn't seem to me that there's any reason not to build Keystone. Should I do one more? Ma'am.
Thank you, Wanda Felton, EXIM Bank. This was riveting. The countries that you described that have completed the development cycle and took the hard medicine were all Asian, if I recall. And the conventional wisdom is that it takes an authoritarian regime, and I just want to do that. And I'm wondering if you could shed any light on what allowed those countries to do that, and if you have any insights. Thank you.
Sure. Well, for those of you who have kids who go to school, and if you've seen any Chinese parents, you remember the Tiger Bomb book? Amy Chua says, when you ask a Chinese parent, how do you get your kids to do violin practice for 2 hours on top of all their homework? She says the difficult question for a Chinese parent is not how to get them to do the 2 hours of violin practice. It's the 3rd hour. That's the trick. Look, there's no question that there is something about the collectivity in some of these Asian countries that has allowed them to perform. And that is, in some cases, authoritarian regimes. In some cases, it has just been a sense of solidarity. So the Japanese did not have a particularly authoritarian regime, but you go to Japan and you see that sense of group solidarity, which, by the way, has been one of the reasons it's been tough for them to get out of this crisis, because when all the companies are doing equally badly, they don't want to let the bad ones go down. They feel like, these guys are with us together. So it's the same model that helped them on the way up. There's no question that group mentality of setting a goal helps them enormously. So if you look at the way in which the Chinese viewed the Olympics, this was seen as a great national project that everybody in China was rooting for, building for. If you look at the way the Russians viewed Sochi, this was this kind of crazy idea of Putin's entirely, and it was, the Russians were not invested in it in quite the same way. So some of it is cultural. A lot of it, I would argue, though, is a political system that allows you to invest in the future and to take pain in the present for future. This is, I think, one of the big challenges for all countries going forward, which is, can you take short-term pain for long-term gain? If you look at the United States as an example, we find it very hard to do that. And, we lecture everybody else about this, but when we have growth, do you see the federal government saying, oh, let's run surpluses and put that away and retire the debt and make all these prudent investments? No. Do you see the Federal Reserve, which is insulated from all this, can't even do it? So when growth was good and people were telling Greenspan to raise rates, he couldn't do it. The last Fed chairman to do that was Paul Volcker. And Volcker came out of a tradition that William McChesney Martin, the Fed chairman of the 50s, said. He said the definition of a Fed chairman is, you are the man who takes the punch bowl away just as the party has begun. Right? And nobody in America wants to take the punch bowl away when the party has begun. Greenspan put grain alcohol in the punch bowl when the party had begun. But that's the real challenge. And it's not just for emerging markets, it's for all of us, which is, can you take short-term pain for long-term gain? And if you can do it, you are investing in the future. If not, you're just consuming. And consumption can give you growth for a while, but eventually it's over. And if you've taken grain alcohol, you've got a hangover. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Really very generous to give me the time. Thank you. There's more on Sunday, not here, on CNN, 10 o'clock. Let's give Fareed another round of applause. That was spectacular. He's got to get back to New York to finish the show. We're very generous to come in today. That's the end of our program. Thank you for joining us. I have only two requests. One, export more. Two, you're going to get an email survey in the next few days. Please fill it out so we can do a better job next year. We want to do a much better job. And the only way we can do this is getting your feedback of what you liked, what you didn't like, and how we can change things. So thank you. Thanks for joining us, and have a safe trip home.